The headlights died first, then the engine choked and drowned somewhere beneath her feet. Petra Owens sat rigid in the driver's seat as water crept past the door seals, cold and relentless, turning the sedan into a sinking tomb. The rain hammered the roof like gravel, each gust of wind rocking the vehicle on its chassis. Beyond the windshield, twin iron gates rose from the flood, lit by a single lantern that swayed in the storm. Behind them, a gravel drive vanished upward into darkness, toward something large and looming she could barely distinguish from the low clouds. She'd taken the valley road because the highway was closed. The detour was supposed to save her 3 hours. Instead, the creek had jumped its banks and swallowed the asphalt whole, and now she was trapped at the gate of someone's private estate, with water rising past the door handles and her phone showing no signal. Petra reached for the door handle, then stopped. Opening it would let the flood pour in. Staying meant waiting for the water to reach the windows, then the roof. She closed her eyes, ran the calculations. Flow rate, vehicle displacement, time to full submersion. 4 minutes, maybe 5. The decision made itself. She sucked in a breath, shoved the door open, and the river claimed her. The cold was a fist closing around her chest. She kicked upward, broke the surface, gasping, and immediately the current yanked her sideways. Her laptop bag was already gone, swept into the dark. She clawed toward the gate, fingers numb, and managed to catch one of the iron bars. The metal bit into her palms, but she held on, dragging herself hand over hand until she could wedge her shoulder against the post. Rain lashed her face. She couldn't see more than a few feet in any direction, just black water and blacker sky and the swaying circle of lantern light that turned the flooding into something ancient and merciless. Then the light changed, shifted. A figure moved through it, tall and pale, descending the drive with a stride so steady he might have been walking through summer grass instead of thigh-deep floodwater. Petra blinked rain from her eyes. The man was dressed in dark clothing that clung to his frame, his hair nearly white even in the dim light, and he moved toward her without hurry, without hesitation, as though he'd done this 1,000 times before. He reached the gate and stopped, looking down at her with eyes that caught the lantern light and threw it back colorless and flat. His face was all angles, carved from marble, ageless in a way that made her breath catch for reasons that had nothing to do with the cold. The latch, Petra managed through chattering teeth, nodding toward the gate mechanism. I can't. He didn't answer. He simply reached through the bars, wrapped one hand around her upper arm, and with his other hand flicked the gate latch open as easily as turning a page. Then he pulled her through the gap, and without a word, bent and lifted her clear out of the water. Petra's protest died unspoken. He'd scooped her up like she weighed nothing, one arm beneath her knees and the other around her back, cradling her against a chest that gave off no warmth. She should have fought it, should have insisted she could walk, but her legs had gone nerveless, and the current was still tearing at them both, and his hold was the only solid thing in a world gone liquid and violent. He turned and began walking back up the drive, carrying her as though the flood and the storm and the midnight darkness were minor inconveniences beneath his notice. Petra stared up at his profile. Rainwater streamed down his face, but he didn't blink, didn't grimace. His skin was pallor itself, bloodless white that seemed to glow faintly in the storm, and his hair hung in pale ropes past his collar. Everything about him was wrong, impossible, from the supernatural steadiness of his gait to the way he didn't seem to breathe. Recognition slid through her sluggish thoughts, sharp and cold as the water still dripping from her clothes. Vampire. She'd heard the rumors in town when she'd stopped for gas that afternoon. The old Lysander estate, they'd said. Hasn't had a visitor in decades. The owner keeps to himself. Strange hours, strange habits. Nobody goes up there after dark. She'd dismissed it as rural superstition, the kind of folklore that clung to old money and older houses. But the man carrying her through the flood had skin like snow and eyes like winter sky and a stillness that belonged to statues, not living men. The house materialized out of the rain, a sprawling stone manor with tall windows and a covered portico. He mounted the steps without slowing, shouldered open a heavy oak door, and carried her into a vast entrance hall lined with dark wood and darker paintings. The silence inside was immediate and absolute. No rain, no wind. Only the steady drip of water from their clothes onto marble tile. He set her down carefully, steadying her with one hand until her legs remembered how to lock. Then he stepped back, putting a precise 3 feet of distance between them, and regarded her with an expression that gave away nothing. "You'll want dry clothes," he said. His voice was low and even, accent faint but unplaceable, vowels shaped by centuries she couldn't begin to guess. "And something warm to drink." Petra hugged her arms around herself, shivering so hard her teeth clicked. "I thank you. I'm sorry for the intrusion. The road flooded and my car, I saw." He turned without waiting for her to finish, moving toward a broad staircase. "Follow me." She followed because there was nothing else to do. Water squelched in her shoes with every step. Her jeans clung to her legs, heavy and frigid, and her sweater had gone from charcoal gray to black with saturation. She was acutely aware of the trail of water she was leaving across what looked like antique rugs worth more than her annual salary. He led her up 2 flights of stairs and down a hallway hung with tapestries that might have been medieval. The house was immense, room opening onto room, all of it furnished in heavy wood and rich fabrics that spoke of wealth measured in generations. Sconces lined the walls, their electric bulbs shaped like candle flames, and the air smelled faintly of old paper and older stone. He stopped at a door near the end of the hall and pushed it open, gesturing her inside. The room beyond was a bedroom, dominated by a 4-poster bed draped in deep blue fabric. A fireplace took up most of one wall, already laid with wood but unlit. "The bathroom is through there," he said, nodding toward a second door. "You'll find towels and a robe. I'll bring clothing." Petra opened her mouth to thank him again, but he was already gone, moving with that same unnatural quiet that made no sound on the old floorboards. She stood dripping in the center of the room for a long moment, trying to piece together what was happening. Then the cold won out over confusion, and she stumbled toward the bathroom, peeling off her soaked sweater as she went. The bathroom was all white marble and gleaming fixtures, with a clawfoot tub big enough to swim in and a shower enclosure that looked like it had been added sometime in the last few decades. She stripped out of her wet clothes, left them in a sodden heap, and wrapped herself in a towel so thick and soft it felt like stepping into a cloud. When she emerged, she found a stack of clothing laid out on the bed. Fleece-lined leggings, a loose linen shirt, a heavy knit cardigan. All of it looked new, tags still attached, sized for a woman her height. She frowned at them, wondering what kind of man kept a wardrobe of women's clothing on hand, then decided she was too cold to care. She dressed quickly, the dry fabric a mercy against her chilled skin, and was toweling her hair when a soft knock sounded at the door. "Come in," she called, expecting him to enter. Instead, his voice came from the hallway. "There's tea in the sitting room, 2 doors down on the left. Join me when you're ready." Footsteps retreated before she could answer. Petra finished with her hair, ran her fingers through the damp tangles, and ventured back into the hall. 2 doors down. The sitting room proved to be a smaller space, comparatively speaking, with tall bookshelves and a fire now crackling in the hearth. He stood beside the fire, one hand resting on the mantel, staring into the flames with an expression of profound detachment. He'd changed as well, trading the soaked dark clothes for black trousers and a white shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows. The firelight painted him in shades of amber and shadow, but his skin remained that impossible white, and his hair fell in pale waves that looked silver in the shifting light. "Sit," he said without turning. "The tea will help with the cold." Petra sank into one of the armchairs near the fire and reached for the teacup on the side table. The porcelain was delicate, painted with tiny gold leaves, and the tea inside was dark and fragrant, laced with something that might have been honey or might have been something older. She sipped, and warmth bloomed in her chest, spreading outward to her numb fingers and toes. "I'm Petra," she said, because the silence was growing uncomfortable. "Petra Owens. I'm a hydrologist. I was driving out to the Ashford Dam to check the sensor array when the road flooded." "Mihai Lysander," he replied, still watching the fire. "This is my home." I gathered. She took another sip of tea. How long have you lived here? Long enough. It wasn't an answer, but she didn't press. She was beginning to understand that Mihai Lysander did not offer information freely. The flood came up fast, she said instead. Too fast for a normal storm surge. I've been monitoring the watershed for 3 months, and the models didn't predict anything like this. That got his attention. He turned to look at her, his pale eyes sharp and assessing. You think it's unnatural. I think the data doesn't match the precipitation. She set the teacup down, her scientist's mind engaging despite the surreal circumstances. The Upper Valley dams should be holding. They were retrofitted 5 years ago. But if the flow rate I measured tonight is accurate, at least 2 of them are failing or have already failed. Mihai moved away from the fire, crossing to the window. He pushed aside the heavy curtain and looked out into the storm, though Petra couldn't imagine he could see anything through the rain-lashed glass. The dams have been managed poorly for years, he said quietly, sold and resold to corporations that care more for profit than safety. That's what I'm here to document, Petra said. I work for the State Water Commission. We've had reports of irregular releases, maintenance logs that don't match the actual conditions. I was supposed to spend the next 2 weeks pulling data from the remote sensors and comparing them to the official records. You'll be here longer than 2 weeks, Mihai said. His tone was flat, factual. The valley will flood completely before morning. The roads won't be passable for days, perhaps longer. Petra's stomach dropped. My equipment is in the car. My laptop, my field kit, everything. Gone by now. He let the curtain fall and turned back to her. The current is strong enough to move vehicles. Your car will be somewhere downstream, if it hasn't been buried in debris. She wanted to argue, but she'd seen the violence of the water. He was right. I need to contact my office, she said instead. Let them know I'm safe. Do you have a landline? My cell isn't getting signal. The phone lines are down. They go down every storm. He crossed to a cabinet along the wall and opened it, revealing a radio setup that looked military grade. I have a shortwave, but you'd need to know someone with a receiver. Of course you have a shortwave, Petra muttered. She scrubbed her hands over her face, exhaustion and frustration warring in her chest. Okay, so I'm stuck here until the water recedes. I'm sorry to impose. I'll try to stay out of your way. Mihai studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he inclined his head, a gesture so slight she almost missed it. You'll stay in the East Wing, he said, the room you're in now. Don't go into the West Wing. Don't go outside after dark, even when the rain stops. The grounds are not safe at night. Why not? Because I say so. It was the first hint of command in his voice, edged and absolute. Petra bristled instinctively, but something in his eyes stopped her retort. There was no threat there, only certainty. He was not negotiating. Fine, she said. East Wing only. Stay inside at night. Anything else? Sleep, he said. You'll be safe here. He left without another word, pulling the door shut behind him. Petra sat alone by the fire, listening to the rain hammer the windows and the distant rumble of floodwater tearing through the valley. Safe, he'd said. She believed him, despite the strangeness of the situation, despite the uncanny stillness of his presence, because when he'd carried her out of the flood, she'd felt the strength in his arms, the unyielding steadiness of his grip. Whatever Mihai Lysander was, he'd chosen to pull her from the water instead of leaving her to drown. That had to count for something. She finished the tea, banked the fire, and made her way back to the bedroom. The bed was as comfortable as it looked, the mattress firm and the blankets heavy. She slid beneath them and closed her eyes, and despite everything, sleep came quickly. She woke to gray daylight filtering through the curtains and the smell of coffee drifting up from somewhere below. Petra sat up, disoriented for a moment by the unfamiliar room and the muffled roar of water outside. Then the previous night came rushing back and she groaned, dragging a hand through her tangled hair. She found her way downstairs by following the scent of coffee, winding through hallways until she located a large kitchen at the back of the house. It was surprisingly modern compared to the rest of the manor, all stainless steel and stone counters, with a row of windows overlooking what might once have been a garden but was now a churning expanse of brown water. Mihai stood at the counter, pouring coffee into a mug. He glanced up when she entered, nodded once, and pushed the mug toward her. "There's bread and preserves in the cupboard," he said. "Help yourself." Petra accepted the coffee gratefully and took a cautious sip. It was strong and black, exactly what she needed. She found the bread fresh somehow, though she couldn't imagine when he'd baked it and slathered it with strawberry preserves that tasted homemade. Mihai didn't join her. He stood by the window, hands clasped behind his back, watching the flood with an intensity that bordered on hypnotic. "How high will it get?" Petra asked around a mouthful of bread. "Another 6 feet, perhaps more. The estate is on high ground. We won't be touched." "But the valley will be underwater." His jaw tightened, the first real emotion she'd seen from him. Farms, homes, the old mill, all of it gone. Petra set down her coffee, her appetite evaporating. The dams shouldn't have failed, not all of them at once. Even with poor maintenance, the redundancy system should have. "They didn't fail," Mihai interrupted. His voice was very quiet. "They were opened." She stared at him. "That's not possible. The manual overrides require authorization from the State Commission and physical access to the control rooms. Nobody human," he said, still watching the water. "But there are other interests in this valley, Miss Owens, interests that do not answer to your State Commission." The way he said it made her skin prickle. "You're talking about vampires." He turned to face her fully, and for the first time she saw something like approval in his pale eyes. "You're not afraid of the word." "I'm a scientist. I deal in facts." She crossed her arms, forcing herself to meet his gaze. "The facts are that you don't breathe, you don't eat, your skin has no color, and you move like gravity doesn't apply to you. Either you're a vampire or you're something I don't have a name for yet." "Vampire will suffice." He moved to the counter, refilled his own mug with coffee he wouldn't drink, a gesture of normalcy that somehow made the whole conversation more surreal. "I am also the last landholding king in this region, a title that matters to no one but others of my kind." "King," Petra repeated. She thought about the size of the estate, the obvious age of the house, the way he carried himself with that bone-deep certainty of authority. "Okay, so you're a vampire king. And you think other vampires opened the dams deliberately?" "I don't think, I know." He set the mug down untouched. "There is a syndicate, modern vampires who have decided that the old ways are inefficient. They deal in blood trade, farming humans like cattle. They want this valley because it's remote, easy to control. But I own most of the land, and I will not sell." Petra's mind raced. "So they're flooding you out, destroying the valley to force your hand?" "Yes. That's insane. The ecological damage alone. They don't care about ecology." His voice hardened. "They care about profit and control. The valley will recover eventually. By then, they'll have built their facilities and secured their supply chains." She wanted to argue that it couldn't be that simple, that there were laws and oversight and consequences. But she'd spent 3 months documenting the ways those systems had already failed, the corners cut and the records falsified. If someone wanted to hide a conspiracy, the chaos of a natural disaster would be the perfect cover. "My data," she said slowly. "The sensor readings I've been collecting. If I can prove the releases were deliberate and not the result of structural failure, then you have evidence of a crime that no human court will believe." Mihai's expression was bleak. "Vampires are legends, Miss Owens. Ghost stories. Your commission will assume equipment malfunction or human error." "Not if the pattern is clear enough." She began pacing, her scientist's mind latching onto the problem like a lifeline. "The sensors log everything. Flow rates, gate positions, reservoir levels. If all the dams opened simultaneously, that's not random failure. That's coordination. And if I can show that the timing doesn't match any authorized release schedule, your equipment is at the bottom of the flood." She stopped pacing. "The sensors are still running. They're solar-powered and transmit to a remote server. If I can get access to a computer with internet, I can pull the data." Mihai regarded her in silence for a long moment. Then he gestured toward a door at the far end of the kitchen. "My study. There's a computer. Use whatever you need." The study was a large room lined with books in a dozen languages, many of them leather-bound and old enough to be museum pieces. The computer was incongruously modern, a sleek desktop with multiple monitors arrayed across a wide desk. Petra sat down and pulled up the remote access portal for the sensor network. Her login still worked, and within minutes she had data streaming across the screen in neat columns of numbers and timestamps. She lost track of time, absorbed in the patterns emerging from the raw information. Mihai drifted in and out, silent as a shadow, bringing her water she barely noticed and adjusting the curtains when the daylight began to fade. It was full dark outside when she finally sat back, her eyes burning and her neck stiff. "You were right," she said. Mihai was standing by the window again, though she hadn't heard him enter. All 6 dams in the upper valley opened within a 20-minute window, starting at 8:15 last night. There was no authorization code, no remote command logged. Someone physically opened the gates. "The syndicate has people in place," Mihai said. "Human employees they've turned or bribed, it wouldn't be difficult. But it's proof." She turned to look at him, excitement overriding exhaustion. "This data is time-stamped and authenticated. It shows deliberate sabotage. If I can get this to the right people, they'll bury it." He didn't turn from the window. "The syndicate has resources you can't imagine, Miss Owens. Money, influence, connections. They'll discredit you, destroy your career, make you disappear if necessary." "So we do nothing?" She stood, anger flaring hot in her chest. "Let them get away with it? Let the valley drown and people lose everything?" "No." He turned, and something in his face had changed, hardened. "We use your data and my authority together. I still have standing in the old courts, power the syndicate cannot ignore. But I need proof, evidence they cannot deny. Your data gives me that." "The old courts," Petra repeated. "Vampire courts. Yes. There are laws among my kind, Miss Owens. Old laws that predate your nation. The syndicate is breaking them, not just by opening the dams, but by operating on territory I claimed centuries ago. If I present your evidence to the High Council, they will have to act." She wanted to feel relief, but a cold knot of fear had settled in her stomach. "You're going to go to war over this. I'm going to enforce the law." He moved away from the window, crossing to stand before her. Up close, his presence was overwhelming, ancient and powerful and utterly inhuman. "But it will be dangerous. The syndicate will strike back when they learn what we're planning. You should leave as soon as the road's clear." "And go where?" She lifted her chin, refusing to look away. "They already know I'm here, don't they? They flooded the valley. They'll know I was in the area, that I have the data. If they're willing to kill to protect their operation, I'm already a target." Mihai's expression flickered, something like pain crossing his features before the mask descended again. "I can protect you here. The estate has wards, defenses. But once you leave, then I don't leave." The decision crystallized as she spoke. "Not until this is finished. You need my data. I need your protection. We work together. You don't know what you're agreeing to. I know the valley is drowning because some vampires decided profit matters more than people's lives. I know I have evidence that can stop them. And I know you're the only one who can make sure that evidence gets heard." She held out her hand. "So let's stop them." He looked at her hand for a long moment, then slowly, carefully, reached out and clasped it. His skin was cool and dry, his grip controlled, and the contact sent a shiver up her arm that had nothing to do with cold. "Very well," he said. "We stop them together." He released her hand and stepped back, and Petra had to resist the urge to close the distance again. There was something magnetic about him, a pull she didn't entirely understand and didn't have time to examine. "I'll need to compile a full report," she said, forcing her mind back to the work. "Cross-reference the dam openings with weather data, show that the storm alone couldn't have caused this level of flooding. It'll take time." "You have time. The roads won't clear for days." He moved toward the door, then paused. "There's food in the kitchen. I won't join you, but help yourself to anything you find." "You don't eat," Petra said. It wasn't a question. "No. But you drink blood." "Yes." She waited, but he didn't elaborate. After a moment, she asked, "From humans?" Not for a long time. His voice was carefully neutral. I have arrangements, suppliers who provide what I need. No one is harmed. She believed him, though she couldn't entirely explain why. Maybe it was the way he held himself apart, the careful distance he maintained. A predator who hurt people wouldn't work so hard to avoid them. Okay, she said. Thank you for telling me. He inclined his head and left, pulling the door shut quietly behind him. Petra returned to the computer and dove back into the data, but part of her mind kept circling back to the feel of his hand in hers, the weight of his gaze, the careful courtesy with which he moved through his own home. Mihai Lysander was a vampire king who hadn't let a living human past his walls in a century, and she was trapped here with him by a flood that might not be over for weeks. She should have been terrified. Instead, she felt safer than she had in months. The next 3 days fell into a rhythm. Petra worked in the study, building her case piece by piece, while Mihai kept to the other parts of the house. She saw him mostly at dusk and dawn, brief encounters in hallways or doorways where he would ask if she needed anything and she would say no, and they would part again in silence. The flood continued to rise. By the second day, the water had claimed the lower gardens and was lapping at the base of the portico steps. By the third, the entire valley was a vast lake, brown and turbulent, studded with the tops of trees and the roofs of drowned buildings. Petra watched it from the study windows and felt sick. On the fourth night, Mihai appeared in the study doorway just after sunset. There are people trapped, he said without preamble. A farmhouse 2 miles east. The family is on the roof. The rescue helicopters can't fly in this wind. Petra pushed back from the desk. Can you reach them? Yes, but I'll need supplies, medical kit, blankets, food. The storage room is downstairs, first door on the right past the kitchen. Gather what you can. She didn't ask why he needed her help or why he was going at all. She just ran. The storage room was exactly where he'd said, stocked with emergency supplies that looked military surplus. She grabbed blankets, a first aid kit, bottles of water, energy bars, stuffing everything into a waterproof duffel. When she emerged, Mihai was waiting by the back door, dressed in black and already wet from the rain. Stay inside, he said, taking the duffel from her. Lock the doors. Don't open them for anyone but me. Be careful, she said, and his eyes widened fractionally, as though surprise was an emotion he'd forgotten how to feel. I will, he said, and then he was gone, swallowed by the storm. Petra locked the door and paced the kitchen, unable to settle. She tried to return to her work but couldn't focus. Instead, she stood at the window and stared out into the rain, watching for any sign of movement. He returned 3 hours later, soaked and exhausted in a way she hadn't thought possible for a vampire. He'd brought the family with him, a mother, father, and 2 small children, all of them shivering and terrified. Petra helped get them settled in guest rooms, found dry clothes that mostly fit, made tea and soup and sandwiches, while Mihai built fires in every hearth on the east wing. The children stared at him with wide eyes, but he spoke to them gently, his voice low and reassuring, and eventually they stopped flinching when he came near. The parents thanked them both a dozen times before exhaustion claimed them, and they retreated to their rooms. Petra found Mihai in the sitting room afterward, standing by the fire with that same distant look he wore when he thought no one was watching. You saved them, she said quietly. I could reach them. No one else could. He didn't turn. It's not heroism, Miss Owens. It's capability. You could have let someone else handle it. Waited for the storm to break. They would have died waiting. She crossed to stand beside him, close enough to feel the faint chill that radiated from his skin. You care about this valley, the people in it. I've lived here for 3 centuries. I've watched families grow and die, generations turning like seasons. This land is mine to protect, whether they know it or not. His voice was soft, almost wondering. I did not expect to care, but isolation has a way of clarifying what matters. Petra thought about the careful distance he maintained, the empty halls of the vast house, the century of self-imposed exile. Why did you shut yourself away? Because the world changed, and I did not. He finally looked at her, his pale eyes reflecting firelight like mirrors. I was turned in a different age. Miss Owens. One of courts and blood oaths and honor worth dying for. The modern world is too loud, too fast, too careless with life. I could not reconcile what I was with what the world had become, so I withdrew. But you let me stay. You were drowning. He said it simply, as though that explained everything. Perhaps it did. Thank you, she said, for pulling me out, for all of this. He turned back to the fire, but not before she caught the ghost of something on his face, fragile and quickly hidden. You should rest. Tomorrow will bring more work. She wanted to push, to ask what he was thinking, but the set of his shoulders told her the conversation was over. So she bid him good night and left him to his vigil, feeling the weight of his gaze on her back until she turned the corner and disappeared from view. The family left 2 days later, ferried out by helicopter when the wind finally calmed enough for rescue operations to resume. The children hugged Petra goodbye and gave Mihai shy waves that he returned with solemn nods. After they were gone, the house felt larger and emptier than before. Petra threw herself into the data, compiling charts and graphs that showed the pattern of sabotage in stark, undeniable detail. She worked late into the nights, fueled by coffee and determination, and began to notice the small ways Mihai looked after her. Fresh coffee appeared at her elbow, without her asking. The fire in the study was always lit when she arrived in the morning. Once, she dozed off at the desk and woke to find a blanket draped over her shoulders and the computer screen dimmed. He never mentioned it, never lingered for thanks. But the care was there, quiet and constant, and it made something warm unfurl in her chest. On the 8th night, she found him on the second-floor balcony that overlooked the flooded valley, standing in the rain without a coat. "You'll catch cold?" she said from the doorway, then laughed at herself. "Never mind." "I can't get sick," he confirmed, glancing over his shoulder. "But I appreciate the concern." She stepped out onto the balcony, letting the rain soak into her hair. It was lighter now, more mist than downpour, and the clouds were beginning to break apart overhead. The water's receding, she observed. The flood had dropped at least 2 feet in the last day, leaving fresh tide lines on the trees. Yes, the worst is over. He didn't sound relieved. Which means the syndicate will move soon. They'll know I'm aware of their operation by now. They'll either negotiate or attack. What do you think they'll do? Attack. He said it with the calm certainty of someone who'd lived through countless conflicts. They're modern vampires. They don't believe in the old laws, don't respect the old authorities. To them, I'm an obstacle to be removed. Fear spiked through her. Then we need to get the data to your council as soon as possible. The council meets in the city, 300 miles south. I'll need to go in person, present the evidence directly. He turned to face her fully. You'll be safer here. The estate has protections, wards that will hold even if I'm not present. Or I could come with you. The words came out before she could think them through. You said yourself I'm already a target. If the syndicate comes here, the wards will hold, he repeated, but there was tension in his voice now, the first crack in his composure. I can't protect you if we're both in the city. The council chamber is neutral ground, but the streets outside are not. If the syndicate sends assassins, then you'll need someone watching your back. She stepped closer, close enough to see the fine tension in his jaw. I'm not helpless, Mihai, and this is my fight too. Those dams, that data, people's homes, I'm not sitting in a locked room while you risk your life to fix it. You are mortal, he said, and for the first time she heard real emotion in his voice, raw and jagged. Fragile. If you're hurt because of me, I won't be. Not if we're smart. She reached out slowly, giving him time to pull away, and rested her hand on his arm. Through the wet fabric of his shirt, she could feel the unyielding strength beneath, cool and steady. Let me help, please. He stared down at her hand, his expression caught between longing and anguish. Then, carefully, he covered her hand with his own. You're asking me to bring you into danger I've spent a century avoiding. he said quietly. To put you in the path of creatures who would tear you apart without hesitation. I know. And you still want to come? Yes. He closed his eyes, and when he opened them again, something fundamental had shifted in his gaze. The walls were still there, the careful control, but behind them she caught a glimpse of the depth of feeling he'd been holding back. Very well, he said. We leave when the road's clear. Together. His hand was still covering hers, and neither of them moved to break the contact. They stood that way for a long moment, rain misting around them and the flooded valley stretching dark below, and Petra felt the weight of a choice being made, an acknowledgement passing between them too profound for words. Then Mihai stepped back, releasing her hand, and the moment fractured. You should get dry, he said, his voice carefully neutral again. We have preparations to make. She nodded and turned to go, but at the doorway she paused and looked back. He was watching her, his expression unguarded for once, and the naked want in his eyes stole her breath. Then he turned away, and she fled inside before she could do something foolish like cross back to him and damn the consequences. The roads opened 3 days later. The flood had receded enough to reveal the full scope of the damage. Homes collapsed, fields buried in mud, the old mill reduced to a skeleton of broken timbers. Emergency crews were everywhere, and the state had declared the valley a disaster zone. Petra compiled the final report, encrypted it, and backed it up on 3 separate drives. The evidence was overwhelming. A clear pattern of deliberate sabotage timed to maximize damage. Any objective analysis would reach the same conclusion. Whether the Vampire Council would care was another question. They left at dusk. Mihai's car, a sleek black sedan that handled the damaged roads with ease. He drove in silence, his focus absolute, and Petra watched the ruined valley slip past and tried not to think about what they were driving toward. Tell me about the council, she said when they'd been on the highway for an hour. How does it work? The High Council is made up of 7 elders, each representing a region. They enforce the old laws, mediate disputes, mete out punishment for those who break the codes. He kept his eyes on the road. I hold a seat by right of age and territory, but I haven't attended in decades. My presence will be noted. Will they listen to you? They'll have to. I'm bringing evidence of law breaking on a scale they can't ignore. His hands tightened on the wheel. But the syndicate will have advocates too, modern vampires with modern money. It will be a battle of politics as much as law. And if the council sides with the syndicate, then we've lost, and the valley belongs to them. He glanced at her, his expression grim. Which is why you're going to stay in the car while I'm inside. The council chamber is safe, but if the decision goes against me, we'll need to leave the city immediately. Mihai. This is not negotiable, Petra. The use of her first name caught her off guard, made her breath hitch. You've given me the evidence I need. Let me do the rest. She wanted to argue, but the set of his jaw told her it would be pointless. So she nodded and turned her attention back to the window, watching the landscape blur past in the gathering dark. They reached the city just before midnight. Mihai navigated through streets she didn't recognize, avoiding the downtown lights in favor of older neighborhoods where the buildings leaned close and the streetlights flickered. He pulled into an underground garage beneath what looked like an abandoned office building and parked in a spot marked with a symbol Petra didn't recognize. Wait here, he said, killing the engine. Lock the doors. If I'm not back in 2 hours, drive away and don't stop until you reach the state capitol. I'm not leaving you. If I'm not back in 2 hours, I'm dead or taken. He said it flatly, without drama. And they'll come for you next. So you drive, you get somewhere public and well lit, and you send the data to every news outlet and government agency you can think of. Burn the syndicate down even if it exposes our kind. Do you understand? Her throat closed around a protest. She managed a nod. Mihai reached into the back seat and pulled out a leather case she hadn't noticed before. Inside were the data drives and her printed report, organized and indexed. He tucked it under his arm and then, to her surprise, reached out and cupped her face gently with his free hand. You've been braver than I had any right to ask, he said softly. Thank you. Then he was gone, moving through the garage with that preternatural speed, and Petra was alone in the car with the doors locked and 2 hours stretching ahead of her like an eternity. She lasted 40 minutes before fear and frustration won out. She couldn't sit here waiting, not knowing. If Mihai was in danger, she had to at least try to help. She grabbed her phone, made sure the data was fully backed up to the cloud, and slipped out of the car. The building above the garage was dark but not abandoned. She could feel the weight of presence, the sense of occupied space as she made her way up a concrete stairwell. Voices drifted from somewhere above, too low to make out words but sharp with argument. The stairwell ended at a heavy door marked with the same symbol from the parking spot. Petra pressed her ear against it and heard Mihai's voice, cold and cutting. Violation of territorial law, documented and irrefutable. The syndicate opened 6 dams under my authority without permission, without negotiation. The damage is catastrophic and deliberate. Another voice, smooth and mocking. Damage to human infrastructure. The old laws do not concern themselves with mortal property. The old laws concern themselves with honor and jurisdiction, Mihai shot back. The valley is mine, has been mine for 300 years. You do not move against another elder's territory without challenge. That is law. The law is what we make it, Lysander, and the future belongs to those who adapt. Petra risked cracking the door open an inch. Beyond was a circular chamber, ringed with tiered seating like an amphitheater. The council sat in the upper tiers, 7 figures in dark robes, their faces shadowed. Mihai stood in the center of the floor, alone, facing a group of 4 vampires dressed in modern suits. The syndicate. One of them was speaking now, a woman with platinum hair and a smile like a knife. King Lysander clings to a dying age. The valley is economically depressed, the human population declining. We would bring industry, employment, prosperity. You would bring blood farms and slavery, Mihai interrupted. Breed humans like livestock, erase everything that makes them human. That is not prosperity. That is atrocity. It's efficiency, the woman countered. The old ways are wasteful. Hunting, seduction, the constant risk of exposure, we've moved beyond that. Controlled breeding, willing donors in exchange for safety and comfort. It's symbiosis. It's a cage dressed up as mercy. Mihai's voice could have cut glass. And I will not allow it on my land. One of the council members leaned forward, an ancient vampire with hair like cobwebs. You bring evidence, Lysander. Let us see it. Mihai opened the leather case and began distributing the printed reports to the council. Petra watched from her crack in the door as they examined the data, passing pages back and forth, their expressions unreadable. The silence stretched until the lead counselor spoke. This is compelling. The pattern is clear, but it proves only that the dams were opened, not who opened them. The syndicate has employees at every dam in the valley, Mihai said. Cross-reference the staff records with known associates. Circumstantial, the platinum-haired woman interrupted smoothly. We employ many people, King Lysander. We cannot be held responsible for the individual actions of every human on our payroll. You expect us to believe this was coincidence? Mihai's control was fraying, anger bleeding through. 6 dams, simultaneous failure, in a valley you've been trying to acquire for years? We expect you to prove malice, not merely opportunity. The woman's smile widened. You have data, Lysander, numbers on a page, but you have no witnesses, no confessions, no direct link between the syndicate and the act. Just suspicion and desperation from a king whose power wanes with every passing year. The council murmured among themselves. Petra's heart sank. They were going to side with the syndicate. The evidence wasn't enough. She made a decision born of fury and recklessness. She pushed the door open and stepped into the chamber. Every eye turned to her. Mihai's expression cycled through shock, anger, and fear in the space of a heartbeat. I'm the witness, Petra said, forcing her voice steady. I'm Dr. Petra Owens, state hydrologist. I compiled that data. I can testify that the dam failures were deliberate and coordinated. The lead counselor regarded her with something like curiosity. A human. How did you enter this chamber? I walked. She moved to stand beside Mihai, ignoring the way his hand hovered near her elbow, as though ready to push her behind him. And I can testify before any court, vampire or human, that the syndicate sabotaged the valley's water system to force King Lysander off his land. The platinum-haired woman laughed. Human testimony is worth nothing here, child. You don't even know what you're looking at. I know sabotage when I see it. Petra held up her phone. And I know how to send this data to every major news outlet in the country. Let's see how your operation handles a federal investigation. The chamber went very still. The syndicate vampires exchanged glances, their confidence cracking. You wouldn't, the woman said, but her voice had lost its surety. Exposing our kind. I'll do whatever it takes to protect the valley. Petra met her gaze without flinching. King Lysander offered me protection, and I'm offering him leverage. If the council won't enforce your own laws, the human authorities will enforce theirs. Federal disaster relief, EPA investigations, fraud charges. Your employees will talk when they're facing prison time, and when they do, your whole operation collapses. This is blackmail, one of the syndicate vampires hissed. This is consequences, Mihai said quietly. He'd moved to stand beside Petra, a united front. You broke the old laws. The doctor is offering you a choice: answer to this council or answer to humanity. Choose wisely. The lead counselor stood, and the chamber fell silent. He was ancient, his presence heavy enough to press against Petra's skin like humidity. The evidence is clear, he said, his voice creaking with age. The syndicate acted against King Lysander's territory without sanction. That is lawbreaking. The punishment is restitution and withdrawal. Restitution? The platinum-haired woman's composure shattered. You can't. We can and do. The counselor's gaze swept the syndicate with contempt. You will dismantle your operations in the valley. You will provide funds for the repair and restoration of all damaged infrastructure, and you will not set foot on Lysander land for the next century. Defiance will be met with annihilation. The syndicate vampires looked ready to argue, but the weight of the council's stare crushed the words unspoken. One by one, they bowed their heads in furious submission. This isn't over, the woman said, her eyes locked on Mihai. Yes, he replied calmly. It is. The council dismissed them all with a wave, and Petra found herself being steered out of the chamber by Mihai's hand at the small of her back. They made it to the stairwell before he rounded on her. You were supposed to stay in the car, he said, but there was no heat in it. Only wonder and something that might have been awe. You needed help, she said. I helped. You threatened to expose our kind to the human world. Do you have any idea what risk? Do you have any idea how brave you were in there? She stepped closer, tilting her head back to meet his eyes. Standing alone against them, fighting for a valley most kings would have abandoned decades ago. You're incredible, Mihai. He stared at her, and she watched his control crack and crumble. Then he pulled her against him, one arm around her waist and the other hand cradling the back of her head, and buried his face in her hair. I thought I'd lost you when you walked through that door, he said, his voice muffled and shaking. I thought they'd kill you for the audacity. But they didn't. She wrapped her arms around him, feeling the unnatural stillness of his body, the absence of heartbeat or breath. We won, Mihai. We won, he repeated, and pulled back just enough to look at her. His eyes were bright with something that transcended words, raw and desperate and achingly vulnerable. Petra. She kissed him before he could finish, rising on her toes and pressing her lips to his. He froze for a heartbeat, then made a sound low in his throat and kissed her back with 3 centuries of loneliness and longing distilled into a single point of contact. His mouth was cool and tasted faintly of rain. He kissed like he'd forgotten how and was relearning with every movement, tentative and fierce by turns. When they finally broke apart, both of them were shaking. I don't know how to do this, he admitted, his forehead resting against hers. It's been so long. I don't even know if I remember how to. We'll figure it out, she whispered. Together. He laughed, a sound of pure disbelief and joy, and kissed her again. They drove back to the valley as dawn approached, the sky lightening to pearl gray in the east. Mihai kept one hand on the wheel and the other laced through Petra's fingers, and they talked in fits and starts about everything and nothing, rebuilding the easy companionship that had grown between them during the long days of the flood. The valley was still a wreck when they arrived, but recovery efforts were underway. Work crews swarmed the roads, pumps labored to clear flooded basements, and volunteers distributed supplies from hastily erected tents. Mihai parked outside the estate gates and turned to Petra, his expression serious. "The council's order will hold," he said. "The syndicate will fund the repairs, anonymously. But this valley will take years to fully recover. The land, the ecosystem, the people's lives." "I know," she squeezed his hand, "but it will recover. And we'll be here to help." "We," he repeated, tasting the word. "I've been alone for so long. I'd forgotten what that felt like." "You're not alone anymore," she said firmly. "If you'll have me. If I'll Petra, you're offering to tie yourself to a vampire, an immortal. I will watch you age and die while I remain unchanged." His voice cracked on the last word. "That's not fair to you." "Life isn't fair, but it's what we make of it." She turned to face him fully, cradling his face in her hands. "I don't know what the future holds. Maybe I'll get hit by a bus next week. Maybe I'll live to be 100. But I know I want to spend whatever time I have with you, if you'll let me." "I'll let you," he said hoarsely. "God help me, I'll let you. I'll take every moment you're willing to give." She kissed him again, softer this time, a promise instead of a question. When they pulled apart, the sun was breaching the horizon, spilling gold across the eastern hills. Mihai flinched from the light, and Petra watched as the skin of his hands began to redden where the rays touched. "Inside," she urged, tugging him toward the house. He followed, letting her pull him through the door and into the safety of shadow. They stood in the entrance hall, both of them disheveled and exhausted and grinning like idiots. "I should let you rest," Mihai said, making no move to leave. "You should," Petra agreed, not releasing his hand. They stayed there, suspended in the moment, until finally Mihai sighed and pressed a kiss to her temple. "Later," he promised. "We'll talk about all of this. But for now, sleep. You've earned it." She nodded and made her way upstairs to the room that had become hers. She fell into bed fully clothed and was asleep before her head hit the pillow. The weeks that followed were a blur of activity. The syndicate, under the council's watchful eye, funneled money into the valley through a series of shell companies and grants. Petra coordinated with the State Commission to ensure the repairs were done properly, the dams reinforced and upgraded to modern standards. She wrote reports and gave testimony and became the public face of the recovery effort, while Mihai worked behind the scenes to ensure the vampire world kept its promises. They fell into a rhythm, working side by side during the long evenings when his daylight sensitivity kept him indoors. He taught her about the old laws and the intricacies of vampire politics. She taught him about modern hydrology and introduced him to Netflix. They argued over everything from land use policy to what constituted a proper cup of coffee, and every argument ended with laughter and stolen kisses. 3 months after the flood, the valley was beginning to look like itself again. Fields had been replanted, homes rebuilt, and the seasonal rains had refilled the reservoirs behind the repaired dams. The ecosystem was recovering faster than Petra had dared hope, the wetlands returning to something like their natural state. She stood on the balcony where she'd first kissed Mihai, watching herons pick their way through the shallow marshes as the sun set in a blaze of orange and gold. Mihai emerged from the house, moving to stand beside her. The fading light didn't bother him as much as direct sun, though he still kept to the shadows out of habit. "It's beautiful," Petra said, watching a heron take flight, wings gilded by the dying light. "I'd forgotten what it looked like before." "It will be even better in time," Mihai said. "The land has a way of healing given the chance." She leaned into him, and he wrapped an arm around her waist, pulling her close. They stood in comfortable silence, watching the valley settle into evening. "I've been thinking," Petra said eventually, "about what you said, about watching me age." She felt him tense. "Petra, let me finish." She turned in his arms to face him. "I've been thinking about it, and I have a question. Is it possible? For a human to become a vampire? He went very still. Yes, but it's not something to be decided lightly. The transformation is painful, dangerous, and there's no going back. I understand that. She met his eyes, letting him see her certainty. I'm not asking for tomorrow or even next year, but someday, when I'm ready, when we're both sure, would you consider it? Turning me. Petra. Her name was a prayer and a plea. You would give up your humanity for me? I'd give it up for us, she corrected, for the chance to spend more than a handful of decades together. For the chance to protect this valley for centuries instead of years, she smiled. And yes, for you. Because I love you, Mihai Lysander, and I want forever. He kissed her desperately, pouring everything he couldn't say into the contact. When they finally broke apart, his eyes were bright with unshed tears. I love you, he said, his voice wrecked. I have since the night I carried you out of the rain. I didn't want to, didn't mean to, but I looked down and you were so fierce and alive and I was lost. Then we're both lost, she said, laughing through her own tears, and I wouldn't have it any other way. Someday, he promised, when you're ready, I'll give you forever. I'll hold you to that. They sealed it with a kiss as the last light faded and the stars began to emerge overhead. The years that followed were the happiest of Petra's life. She continued her work with the Water Commission, becoming a leading expert on dam safety and watershed management. Mihai slowly re-emerged into vampire society, using his renewed standing to advocate for the old laws and push back against the syndicate's worst excesses. Together, they turned the valley into a model of sustainable land use, a place where human and vampire interests aligned instead of colliding. They traveled together when Petra's work took her to other regions, Mihai careful to avoid daylight, and Petra careful to avoid questions about her increasingly reclusive partner. They read to each other on quiet evenings, argued over policy and philosophy, and learned each other's histories until they could finish each other's sentences. On Petra's 35th birthday, Mihai took her to the wetlands preserve they'd established on the recovered floodplain. It was twilight, the sky streaked with purple and gold, and the air was alive with the calls of returning wildlife. It's time, Petra said, watching the herons settle into their rookery. I'm ready. Mihai took her hand, raised it to his lips. Are you certain? There's no undoing this. I've never been more certain of anything. She smiled at him, this man who'd carried her out of the flood and into a life she'd never imagined. Make me yours, forever. He kissed her then, tender and reverent, and whispered against her lips, As you wish. The transformation was everything he'd warned her about, and worse. 3 days of fever and agony, her body tearing itself apart and rebuilding cell by cell. Mihai stayed with her through every moment, holding her when she screamed and whispering reassurances when she begged for it to stop. When she finally woke on the 4th night, the world had changed. Everything was sharper, clearer. She could hear Mihai's breathing from across the room, smell the rain 3 miles away, feel the vibration of small creatures moving through the walls. Her body thrummed with strength and her mind felt crystal clear, centuries of human limitation stripped away in an instant. Mihai sat beside the bed, watching her with barely contained hope. How do you feel? He asked carefully. Petra sat up, marveling at the ease of movement, the absence of the small aches and pains that had been her constant companions. She looked at her hands and saw skin as pale as his, veins faint beneath the surface. Alive, she said, and laughed at the irony. More alive than I've ever felt. He pulled her into his arms, and she felt the matching stillness in his chest, the absence of heartbeat that now mirrored her own. They were the same now, eternal and unchanging, bound by choice and transformation. Welcome to forever, he whispered. Forever, she repeated, tasting the word. It didn't frighten her. Not with him. They spent the first weeks of her new existence learning her abilities and limits. Mihai taught her to move with vampire speed, to channel her strength, to manage the hunger that would be her constant companion. Petra discovered she had his sensitivity to sunlight, but not his 3 centuries of discipline, and they laughed together through her fumbling attempts at control. By the end of the first year, she'd adapted fully to her new existence. She continued her work with the Water Commission, though she had to be more careful about appearances, manufacturing excuses for why she no longer aged. Eventually, she would have to disappear and re-emerge under a new identity, but that was a problem for later decades. For now, she had the valley, the work, and Mihai. It was enough. It was everything. On the 5th anniversary of the night he'd pulled her from the flood, they stood together on the balcony watching herons wheel through the dusk. The valley spread below them, green and whole, testament to the work they'd done together. "I've been thinking," Mihai said, his arm around her waist, "about children." Petra blinked up at him in surprise. "I didn't think vampires could—" "We can't, not naturally." He gestured to the valley. "But there are always children who need homes, orphans, refugees. We could offer them safety, family, a place to grow." Her heart, still and silent in her chest, somehow swelled with emotion. "You want to adopt. I want to share what we have. This house, this land, our love." He smiled down at her, tentative and hopeful. "If you're willing." "I'm more than willing," she said, tears she could no longer cry burning behind her eyes. "I think it's perfect." And so they became parents, not through blood, but through choice. Over the decades that followed, they opened their home to children no one else wanted, giving them safety and love and the chance to thrive. Some stayed for years before moving on to their own lives. Others grew old in the valley, building families of their own, while Mihai and Petra remained unchanged guardians. Their first was a boy of 8, solemn and frightened, who they named Casimir after Mihai's long-dead brother. He stayed until adulthood, then left to become a doctor, though he returned often to visit the valley and the parents who'd saved him. Their second was a girl of 5, bright and fearless, who they named Celestine. She grew up wild and beloved, running through the wetlands and learning the names of every bird and plant. She never left, choosing instead to take over Petra's work with the Water Commission when Petra eventually had to retire her current identity. More children followed. Some stayed, some left, but all of them carried the valley with them, the knowledge that they'd been loved and wanted and safe. The house that had stood empty for a century, filled with laughter and life, and Mihai, who'd isolated himself for so long, rediscovered what it meant to be part of a family. Petra watched him bloom over the years, shedding his loneliness like an old coat. He was still serious, still careful, but there was warmth in him now that hadn't existed before. He told stories to the children, taught them chess and Latin, and never once made them feel like burdens. And through it all, their love deepened and evolved, becoming something richer than the desperate passion of those early days. They were partners in every sense, running the valley together, raising children together, facing the challenges of immortality side by side. On their 50th anniversary, they stood once more on the balcony. The valley had changed and changed again over the decades, but the wetlands remained, carefully protected, a testament to what they'd fought for. "Do you regret it?" Mihai asked quietly. "Giving up your mortality?" Petra leaned into him, breathing in the scent of rain and old stone that clung to his skin. "Not for a second. Every choice I've made since that night led me here, to you, to this life. I wouldn't change any of it." He pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "Nor would I. You gave me back the world, Petra, reminded me why it was worth protecting." "We protected it together," she corrected, "and we'll keep protecting it, for as long as it needs us." "Forever," he agreed. They watched the herons settle into their nests as darkness fell, 2 immortal guardians standing watch over the valley that had brought them together. The flood that had trapped her at his gate was long past, but its legacy remained in every restored acre, every thriving wetland, every child they'd sheltered and loved. Mihai had carried her in from the rain that night, a drowning stranger he'd chosen to save. In doing so, he'd saved himself as well, pulling them both from their separate isolation into a shared forever. And as the stars emerged overhead and the night creatures began their songs, Petra knew with absolute certainty that she'd made the right choice. Not just to become a vampire, but to love this man, to fight for this valley. to build a life that spanned centuries instead of decades. The flood had brought her to his gate. Love had brought her home. And that home, that love, that valley full of life and promise would endure long after the last memory of that midnight storm had faded into legend. They had forever to make sure of it.